So, we are talking about romantic poetry. In general, the romantic poets explored three main topics in their poetry. First one, the relationship between humans and nature. The Gothic and the Surreal is the second one. The third one is the what is the purpose of poetry and how the identity of the poet should be understood. The Romantic poets believed that the inner world of humans provided endless possibilities for new ideas and ways of thinking and living, which is exemplified in much of the poetry of the era. We can look more closely at the three main topics of Romantic poetry to see how the spirit of freedom and creativity was expressed throughout the Romantic era. Theme 1, that is, the relationship between humanity and nature. A major theme in Romantic poetry is the relationship between humans and their emotions and the natural world. The Romantic poets felt that humans' internal lives and the exterior natural world had a lot in common. They could be both mysterious, open, and vast, wild and free, and sometimes a little bit terrifying. Romanticism's focus on the relationship between humanity and nature was at least partially inspired by the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, which I have already mentioned. Enlightenment thinkers sought to rationalize natural phenomena. Similarly, industrialism depended on humani- humanity's ability to harness natural forces like water, power, and fossil fuels and put them to work. The new industrial society also required a big human workforce. People's lives were increasingly caught up in working long, harsh hours in grimy factories for long wages, which also forced them to move into dirty, crowded cities. So, how did the Romantic poets respond to the ways that the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution used and controlled nature and human beings? By portraying and praising nature's power to inspire awe and terror in humans instead. Here's what I mean. Think of a time when you heard a booming clap of thunder. It probably startled you, even though it was a pretty cool thing to hear, right? That's what we are. That's what I'm talking about when I say nature can be both awe-inspiring and scary at the same time. To the romantics, those moments of awe and terror in response to grand natural phenomena were a spiritual experience. This spiritual connection to nature came to be known as the sublime. Came to be known as the sublime. In the midst of industrialization, the Romantic poets felt that they bore the responsibility of reinvigorating the spiritual connection to nature by portraying the sublime in their poetry. So, the glorification of nature and its wildness can be seen in William Blake's poem The Tiger and William Wordsworth's poem The Prelude. So, these are the examples of sublime, the sublime. Then the theme 2, the second theme that I'm going to discuss today is the Gothic and the Surreal. When most people think of the Gothic and the Surreal in literature, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first thing that comes to mind. And guess what? It's a romantic novel. While the Gothic and Surreal are more commonly associated with fiction and novels from the Romantic era, these themes also come up in a lot of Romantic poetry too. The Gothic can be thought of as portrayals of terrifying or horrifying phenomena that readers find thrilling. It's kind of like that rush of adrenaline you get when you go through a haunted house or watch a scary movie. Part of the theory behind the Gothic in literature is that people like being scared. Now, let's talk about surrealism. Surrealism and Gothic often go hand in hand. Surrealism goal is to subvert or challenge normal life by tapping into people's unconscious imagination. Think of a wet dream that you had recently where what you were experiencing was not quite real. Whether you are floating above your desk in math class or riding in a car with a long lost friend, dreams often blend bits of reality with your imagination. That, dear readers, is surrealism at work. In poetry from the Romantic era, the Gothic conveys a sort of mysteriousness through the setting and characters. So, to convey Gothic theme, a sort of mysteriousness, poets use the setting and the characters, and it often relies on supernatural forces and the unrealness of nature to create the sense of the surreal. If you are reading a book or poem and there are cobwebs, dark and decaying passageways, or mysterious women who seem capable of putting you under spell, and you have got goosebumps, it's possible you are reading a piece of Gothic literature and experiencing the surreal. So, where can you find this in romantic poetry? Pretty much everywhere. One good example is in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's romantic poem Christabel, which portrays dark scenery, damsels in distress, and alludes to the presence of supernatural forces. For the Romantics, using Gothic imagery was just another way to explore the vast possibilities for human emotion and feeling, and to emphasize the ways that nature has the power to do things that are beyond human control. Now, theme 3, that is odes, relics, and sonnets. So let's talk about odes, relics, and sonnets. Every literary era is known for creating or putting its own twist on different literary forms. For instance, early 20th century novels are known for popularizing the stream of consciousness style, where the author basically writes whatever pops into their head. Additionally, the unique rhyme scheme of the English sonnet was developed during the Renaissance in the 1500s. The also use specific poetic forms like odes, lyrical ballads, and sonnets were popular among the Romantics. Let's quickly define these three poetic forms. So, what do you mean by odes? Okay, so let's discuss about odes. What is odes? So, odes are long, stately, and lyrical. So, these are the essential part of odes. They are long, stately, and lyrical. They are written in stanzas of varied metrical patterns. There will be various metrical patterns. In terms of theme, odes are often fixated on paying tribute to some kind of divine or supernatural creative power that the poet admires and even seeks to possess. So these are the essential qualities of an ode. Okay. Now let's talk about lyric poems. Lyric poems are briefer than odes. These are like smaller. Okay, smaller than odes. If you compare it to the odes, lyric poem poems are smaller. They are often highly emotive and written in the first person. Okay, the lyric poems are basically written in the first person. So the reader gets an intimate look at the feelings of the narrator of the poem, who in romantic poetry is often the poet themselves. So most of the time the narrator is basically the poet himself. Lyric poetry emphasizes sound and pictorial imagery instead of a long narrative or dramatic tale. So the overall thing is that lyric poems are short and they are written in first person, and sometimes the narrator most of the times the narrators are the poets themselves. Now let's discuss sonnets. Sonnets or poems with 14 lines and patterned end rhyme schemes were often used by women poets during the Romantic period to portray the feelings and moods experienced in romantic relationships. Some poets during the era would write sonnet sequences to portray an extended drama between lovers. So, sonnet basically it is of 14 lines. Okay, it has a end rhyme scheme, and basically to define the romantic relationships, the poets of romantic era has used these particular form of poetry. How these forms work in romantic poetry? So, what does the use of these poetic forms have to do with the dominant themes of the romantic area? So, let's connect the things, okay? How these things are connected. So, let's talk about that. Well, the romantic poets are extremely interested in understanding how poetic genius works. In other words, they wanted to figure out what made someone a poetic genius. Thus, it makes sense that romantic poets would write odes lauding the creative genius of the divine beings. Actually, romantic poets saw themselves as creators, and they were constantly searching for inspiration for the creative genius within themselves. Now, the romantic poets also wanted to explore the complexity of how they responded emotionally to their experiences in the natural world. Lyric poetry allowed them to express these emotional reactions in first person by describing the sounds and visual images that caused them. It was a way for poets to share their feelings with their readers. Finally, sonnets also provided an ideal form for expression of feelings exchanged between people. The form of the sonnet was used to move away from the logic and rationality of the Enlightenment and more toward mood and feeling. So, you can take the example of Percy Shelley's, that is P.B. Shelley's Ode to the Western, and you will get all these characteristics in that very poem.